Screen sharing. I think I'm recording. Yes, I am. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2. Sort of zipping on by. We had a very exciting day today, which I have to share with you. We had our own cell tower built. And so now I'm going to have actual good Wi-Fi, which is so exciting. I can't even tell you. We've lived here for a decade and we have never been able to stream anything. We are the only people I know in the world who still gets those little Netflix CDs in the mail. And as I know, it's very, as of today, I think I can finally join the rest of the world with Hulu and Peacock and BritBox and all those fab things. So I just wanted you to share that it is a red letter day here in rural Texas. Anywho, okay. So sound systems week 2. Great to see and this, by the way, this PowerPoint is available if you just want to download it from week 2. It's already in there. Great introduction. So great to hear about your lives and your experiences. And we have some of you still out and about out there. And it's always particularly interesting to hear how you feel about pronunciation and phonology in general, because I wrote to somebody this today, but one of the reasons I ended up doing phonology, I think, was because I was so worried about it. I had tried to learn the IPA as a trainer when I was in my first teacher training certificate in London. I couldn't make sense of it. I had a boyfriend at the time who was also an ESL teacher, and he would write to me in IPA to try and get me used to it. And, and it was very sweet. But in the end of it, I was just like, oh God, I can't do this. And then I went to teach in Hungary, and all the students, they were all adult students. They all knew the IPA and I didn't. So it was really awful. So I think one of the things that always struck me, but I couldn't quite make sense of all of it. So that's why I think I ended up doing this for a living. So what I hope is that by the end of this course, you can make a bit. I always felt the reason I couldn't make any sense of it was because they tried to give me too much all at the same time. Like they tried to give me the entire IPA when you don't need the entire IPA. They tried to give me every single thing, regardless of whether it was pedagogically valuable or not. So that's why we're going to be a little more picky. Plus, the other thing we're going to look at today is online resources, which of course didn't exist back in the day and in the 1980s and now do, and they are awesome. So we're going to have a look at some of those and have you test out some of those. So today we're going to start part 2 of your ginormous textbook, introduction, consonant system, and electronic apps. Okay. All right. So the introduction to part 2 of your book talks about pronunciation varieties, and it cites an article. They actually cite an article that I wrote in 2006. So I thought we would use this to do some of the definitions, and then I've actually uploaded the article for you under week 2. It was an annual review of applied linguistics article. So if you want to read more about these definitions, and you can go ahead and do that. But some of the definitions that we looked at last week, for example, is ELF, English as a lingua franca. So that would be the big change in the last 10 years or so, that we talk about ESL, English as a second language, EFL, English as a foreign language, and now ELF, which is in fact what it's called, English as a lingua franca. So you've got sort of 3 different kinds. And English as a lingua franca is a vehicular language spoken by people who don't share a native variety. So essentially it's part of what Cashrew called the expanding circle. So it would be 2 non-native speakers talking to each other, as opposed to a native speaker talking to a non-native speaker, right? That said, there's so many uses of English across the world. There are constantly native speakers talking to non-native speakers, and non-native speakers talking to non-native speakers, native speakers talking to native speakers. So it's sort of difficult, but the prototypical definition would be two non-native speakers talking to each other. And that comes from this idea of Kashrew's three circles. Some of you may be familiar with this. Did anyone do this in one of their other classes? Yeah, Anne's saying she's familiar, Sarah isn't. Okay, so it's a mix. So this dude, Kashrew, said, if you want to look at the way English is working around the world, you can split it into three different circles. So inner circle, this one at the bottom here, is places where we would typically think of as native speakers. America, England, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and in some cases, South Africa, places like that. Outer circle is defined as places where English is one of the varieties that is spoken, and is usually spoken for things like government and education. So this would include places like India, Africa, Philippines, Indonesia, places like that. And then the final one, the final circle, is what he called the expanding circle, which is where you have English being used as a lingua franca more and more. So you get, and you get now terminology like Chinglish or Singlish for Singapore, Chinglish for Chinese, Spanglish, all kinds of, so that would be the expanding circle, okay? Now I have actually, in my book, when we come to do that, I've actually relabeled them. Kashrew didn't mean to make it sound like the inner circle was the best, but because the inner circle sounds like the inner circle, the people that know what they're doing, I never liked that terminology. So I renamed that traditional Englishes. And then the outer circle, which is essentially, again, I didn't like the terminology. They're not like the outer, you know, we're the right people and they're the wrong people. So I renamed those new Englishes. And then expanding circle I call emerging Englishes. Now, as much as anything else, this is a linguistic, a political, an economic set of definitions, right? So you can either see something like English being used in Asian countries, you know, around Asia, and also that group of countries, as just a kind of lingua franca version of English, but not a real English. Or you can see it as developing into a real systematic variety of English. There's a lot of research that's being done right now in English as a lingua franca, which we talked about last week. So those are people who believe that this is an emerging variety and they want to teach it that way, and they want it to be understood as just as valuable as one of the traditional Englishes, like British English or American English. And this is at least partially because there are millions more people speaking English in those contexts than there are in ours. So there are millions more non-native speakers speaking English to other non-native speakers than there are native speakers speaking English to native speakers, if you see what I mean. So again, that's a huge, you know, it's a thing. And anyone that's interested in that, it's certainly a great 599 or 595 topic to look at: the linguistic ramifications, the political ramifications, the social ramifications of that. But that's where this idea comes from of ELF. So ELF would be essentially that expanding circle. So maybe a Japanese businessman talking to a Chinese businesswoman, for example, would be an ELF interaction, okay? So that's the idea of pronunciation varieties. And in addition to the intelligibility model that we talked about last week, so the idea that you don't base your pronunciation model on native speakers, but you base it on an intelligibility model. Along with that comes this idea of pronunciation varieties as well, you know, so that if, for example, I have students from Saudi Arabia, which I often had in London, they were often quite negative about learning English pronunciation because they never spoke any English to any English people. They only spoke English to other Arabian people or Asian people who they were doing business with in Saudi Arabia. So they weren't that bothered whether they could use British idioms or British, particularly British cultural things, or for example, the glottal stop. So when instead of saying butter, as you would say in this, or butter, we said butter, and all these kind of interesting things that we'll talk about a bit in a bit. But they weren't interested in any of that because none of that meant anything to them. That wasn't going to be part of their English experience. So none of this was recognized. To you now, this all might sound screamingly obvious, which is awesome. But when I started in the 1980s, this whole discussion didn't exist. So it's been a very interesting and exciting time to do pronunciation from that perspective. And then these are some of the other things we talked about last week. Intelligibility, the ability of the listener to recognize individual sounds or utterances. Comprehensibility, which has had a kind of double. Some people talk about it in terms of the ability of the listener to understand the meaning of the utterance, not just be able to decode the syllables, but actually understand the meaning in its given context. Or it's also measured by ease of understanding. So you get a scale, a Likert scale from 1 to 10, and you'll say, how easy is this person to understand? 5, 6, whatever, and that's called a comprehensibility scale. Then there was a third one, which was basically some form of what's called interpretability, which was the ability of the listener to understand the speaker's intentions. But this has largely been dropped because it's very difficult to understand a speaker. You know, you're never quite sure whether you understand a speaker's intentions or not. It's difficult unless you can actually ask the speaker to go back and say exactly what they intended. There's a lot of speculation about what speakers' intentions are. So that's basically been dropped, and what you end up with is this clear distinction between intelligibility, meaning formal decoding of words. Can I decode the words even if I don't understand what the message is? And understanding, so comprehensibility, which is also being called understandability or communicativity. So that's the distinction that we're looking at now instead of looking at a native model. And note that accentedness is a third concept. That's how accentedness interrelates to intelligibility and comprehensibility is an empirical question. And as I said, the research shows that it's complicated. And it's not a simple, if you're more accented, you're less comprehensible. And if you're less accented, you're more comprehensible. It doesn't work that way. All right, so what should you know as a pronunciation teacher? Your book proposes 3 prongs, and I agree with all 3. First of all, knowledge of pronunciation features, so understanding the sound system. This is why we spend 1 class in your MA just looking at the sound system. To me, it's equally important in the same way that you spent a class looking at grammar, you know, the syntactic system and learning that. You now spend a class learning about the sound system because it's equally important, right? Knowledge of what we know about typical student problems. So we started talking about this last week with the Spanish speakers or with the Vietnamese speakers. So we can bring certain understandings of what typically might be transferred. and knowledge of how to prioritize instruction. So again, this idea of what's critical, what should I be spending my time on, what possibly is less than helpful in terms of spending my time on. And then the other thing your book proposes in this introduction is a communicative framework. I just scanned this in from the book, which is why it's so horrible looking. But essentially, it's a standard model for communicative teaching, which is you start with description, you move to listening discrimination, you move to controlled practice, like minimal pairs or so on, guided practice, and then communicative practice. So if you start with something like L and R, I mean, this applies to anything, but let's go with L and R. You start with a description and analysis of L and R. What's the difference between the two? One's lateral, one isn't, etc. Where the air comes through, etc. Then, and again, I point out that this is for adults, not children. Obviously, you don't want to do a long meta-linguistic explanation for children. That's not, that's not going to be useful for them. But for adults, it is. Listening discrimination. So then you do some kind of exercises. Is this an L? Is this an R? And then you do some kind of controlled practice, which means that you're in control of you can hear everything that's being produced. So minimal pairs, for example, so just red, lead, light, right, and so on. So you're actually listening to everything the students are producing. Guided practice is a little more, you'll see some guided activities in your, or you should have done when you had a look at your reading. So things like they're more interesting than a minimal pair, but you know what language is going to be used. So something like the map, you draw a map and you say, you want to go to Royal Lane, so tell your person how to go to, tell your pair how to go to Royal Lane, turn right, turn left, turn, so you're controlling that part of it. All the way through to communicative practice, which basically means you're not controlling all the language. You're setting them up with an activity that should definitely focus on the language structure that you're focusing on, but you're not controlling all the language that's going on in the activity. And your book does add this, but I would add this actually to that. So I would say this should be a 6-stage figure. And this is something I talked about, I think last week too, that because I'm a bit sort of, I go on about it, but this lack of feedback. So I often will observe a classroom, observe a teacher, and I will see no feedback. And then when I ask them what feedback they intend to give in terms of either homework or feedback from the lesson, it's often unclear what they were listening for or anything else. So there are a variety of ways in which you can give feedback, both inside and outside the classroom. Inside the classroom, you can, during some of these lesson 5, communicative practice and even guided practice activities, you could be wandering around the classroom with your notebook and pen, saying, okay, what are the biggest problems that I'm hearing as I go around? And then you can address those recurring issues very specifically with adults. You can say, as I was wandering around, I hear this, I hear that. That's, you can put up some of the errors on the board, and adults respond to that very, very well. Outside of class, students can complete spoken homework. My students always did this. Now it's even easier. They just throw in an MP3 file or whatever, and they, a lot of teachers don't like to do this because they feel that it's so time consuming, although God knows, I don't know how many of you are writing teachers, but writing draft, responding to written drafts always struck me as equally as time consuming, and we weren't giving any choice about that. So one thing I've done with a large class, if I had 30 students, is just split them. So I only have 15 per week. You know, you can do, I had 15, you know, 15 would do some kind of listening practice that I didn't have to respond to. And then 15 would do the spoken practice, the spoken homework that then I would give them spoken responses to over the computer or on the MP3. So you can always do that to divide your, you know, you don't have to do everything with everybody all of the time, but it gives you an option to do that individual feedback at least once every couple of weeks or so. In class, as I said, you can take part of the class session to review. I would always take a Friday and say, okay, here are some of the things that you know, we looked at this week and what you want to think about. And while students are speaking, now, of course, again, I understand that some of you are in situations where you have no time to do all this. You're supposed to be teaching the text, teach test, and God knows what else you're supposed to be doing with these poor kids, but there's no time to do anything. So this is, I understand that. This is all within the criteria of the time that you might have. Certainly if you're running short on time, and one thing that doesn't work well apparently with children, according to the research, but works very well with adults and with teenagers, is recasting. So if your student is saying something, you can recast the pronunciation as part of the feedback, you know, and say, oh, so you said da, 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 or some other kind of repetition, and that can help students to hear the difference. And you can do that without turning it into a thing, you know, without stopping the entire conversation and the entire sort of joy of speaking in the second language. You can just do a bit of recasting if that's what you have time for. So anything, essentially what you should be saying as you're putting together your lesson plan is, how do I intend to assess this at the other end, right? So the lesson plan shouldn't just be, here's a nice lesson plan, you know, short and long vowels, woohoo. It should include in that lesson plan, okay, if I'm going to spend 50 minutes, 2 lessons, 3 lessons doing, how do I intend to assess their progress, and in these different possible ways, okay? All right, so that is part 1. So any questions, comments about what we've done in part 1? Anything sound familiar, or?
I have a question about comprehensibility and intelligibility. I guess I'm just trying to understand it a little bit better. Would comprehensibility be like, for example, my husband, he's a second language, English is a second language. And like, I know for a while when I would ask him a question, he would respond with "I'm," because I am. Like if I said, "Are you ready to go?" He would say "I'm."
Oh,
like,
nice.
like I am.
That's
like
awesome. Yeah.
So then at first, yeah. So would that be like comprehensibility, or like
That would be, yeah. If you knew he was saying I'm, as in you could decode it, you could say, I know exactly what he's saying. He's saying I, you know, dash apostrophe M, then that would be comprehensibility, in the sense that if someone, now in your case, it's a bit tricky for you because you're the wife, so you understand what's going on. If somebody else other than you, so one of your friends or family, could decode the I'm, but then was like, what is that supposed to mean right now? Then that would be a comprehensibility issue. Yeah. Okay. Now, if your family member can't even decode it, like in other words, they're like, did he just speak English, or did he just speak Spanish, or did he just speak Thai? Then that would also be a intelligibility issue.
Okay.
Now, of course, the important point that you raise here, Liliana, is that context is everything. So it in that case, you might not be able to decode it But the fact that you know that that's what he says when he's getting ready to go, or he's ready to go, then it's comprehensible to you.
Right.
So this is, when it comes down to it with the research, you always have to look at comprehensibility, God, Lord, comprehensible or intelligible to whom is always the question. Yeah. So
Okay.
when we do research, we try and make it to the largest possible population. But for example, those of you that have students, adult students who are doing the TOEFL or IELTS, this has become a big argument in testing for adults. Like, if adults are doing TOEFL, who do they need to be comprehensible to? You know, so there's a lot of new research and testing where TOEFL is testing different accents. So they'll, instead of all speakers being from the US, they're having research where people are doing research where they're saying, okay, Indian English speakers, African English speakers, South African English speakers, other emerging English speakers, are these equally comprehensible to people or less comprehensible to people? And it's a super interesting, and we've had mixed results actually with that. There are some arguments that you should not include multiple accents in testing, just American accents. And there are some arguments that say you should include multiple accents. I'm a you should include multiple accents kind of chick, but the research isn't super strong on that just yet. We still need to, I mean, it looks like it can have a negative effect on the learner. So until we're sort of clearer on what it might do to the test taker, right now it's sort of TOEFL runs with all American speakers essentially. Any other questions or comments?
Is the communicative framework for children very different from the one that's for adults that you put up there?
That's an excellent question. Not particularly, no. I mean, if you look at content-based textbooks for children, it's the same. However, the focus is on morphosyntax. So there are very few textbooks at that age focus on pronunciation. I mean, this communicative framework is teaching. I've put on here teaching pronunciation, but in fact, it's across the board, right? It's how we teach grammar. It's how we teach under a communicative framework. You'll follow the same kind of steps. Generally speaking, for children, and those people that are teaching children right now can tell me if I'm wrong, but you sort of get a bit of phonics and that's about it. They sort of assuming that the rest of it's just gonna, you know, come by osmosis, which, you know, certainly it does a lot easier than it does for adults. But then also, as some of you that were in my SLA class in summer, you know, you also get this problem with potentially children who become ESL lifers, who sound like their ESL for as long as they're, you know, for forever essentially. And that might be because of their communities, that their identity, or it might simply be because nobody ever does the work to correct them. So children is a bit tricky and often depends on where you're, but generally speaking, children are just left to, you know, to hopefully work it out. The focus is on the fact that in English, we have a real horrible problem with our morphology, our orthography matching our phonology, right? We all know that it's a nightmare. It doesn't matter what something looked like. For example, when I was learning Hungarian, and I know that's true to an extent for Spanish, if you saw it written down, you knew exactly how it sounded. There was a one-to-one correlation between those two things. So you could sight read a text and sound perfectly good. You know, in English, it's an impossibility. There's so many different, you know, possible sounds that come with one grapheme so this is where the huge focus of K through 12 is with second language children. Yeah, it's really trying to build their literacy. Yeah. All right, then in that case, let's move to part 2, which is this super interesting system of consonants. So we divide the world, as we said last week, into suprasegmentals, intonation, etc., and segmentals. And we divide segmentals into 2 parts, consonants and vowels. So we're going to start with consonants, which is your chapter 3. And I'm hoping that a lot of this should look familiar from 555. This idea that you have 3 properties for the articulation of consonants: voicing, place of articulation, manner of articulation. Am I right that this sounds somewhat familiar to the 5-5? Those of you that have done 555, yes, good. Plenty of nodding, voice, good. I love a nod. All right, brilliant. So I'm not going to spend super amount of time going back over that. But obviously, if you've got an articulate, we talked about this really briefly last week. If you are working with the theta and you've got a learner whose place of articulation, they're not doing, you know, their tongue there, then you know, you can do some of these exercises with M&Ms or with Cheerios or whatever. That would be a place of articulation. If you've got voicing problems, so you can't work out whether it sounds voiced or unvoiced. And then manner of articulation, if something should be a fricative and it sounds like a stop, or vice versa. So all those kinds of things you should have a general idea of, right? I mean, the idea, as I said, the second part of this slide, if there's a real problem with articulation, like you can see that you've got multiple problems with articulation, you might be looking at some form of speech impediment. And, you know, just because they're a second language learner doesn't mean they also might not have a speech impediment, and vice versa, you know. But that's the sort of line where it's between you and a speech pathologist. So that's the sort of moment at which you're like, okay, none of this looks or sounds familiar to me. None of this looks like the typical problems that I see in my experience with Korean learners or with Japanese learners or whatever. I think there might be some other kind of issue. This is particularly important if you're teaching children, obviously. But that's sort of where the line is between, you know, what you're doing and what a speech pathologist might do. So let's just remind ourselves what we said last week. When time is critical. When time is critical, realistically, the chances of an adult learner post-puberty, basically, speaking accentedless English is not high. Because even the smallest tiny things, so voice onset time is what I'm talking about here, and they talk about a little bit in your book. So voice onset time is basically the difference between a voiced consonant and an unvoiced consonant. I'm sure you probably did this in 555. So it's for example, the P sound, just, there is no voicing. The reason that we recognize B as opposed to is that there's a voice onset time, right? And if you could do experiments where you shorten and shorten and shorten the voice onset time for a B, and at some point there's a line and that B sounds like a P. So we are listening to that voice onset time to identify. Now, if your voice onset time is not the same as a native speaker's, it's going to make you sound a little bit different. Not incomprehensible, but a little bit different. It's one of the tiny little things that people say, oh, I don't think that person is a native speaker, you know, but it doesn't matter in the sense that it's completely comprehensible, but it's these tiny, tiny little things. It's not the same as being intelligible. It's not the same as being accented or not accented, and so on. I can't emphasize that more than with adults. And again, as I said last week, there may be some adults that you're teaching who say, not your job to tell me what's comprehensible and non-comprehensible. I want to sound as much as I can like an American, so that's your job. Also fine. They're big boys and girls, and if they want to do that, that's also good. All right, so let's start with a little reading guide on consonants. I'm going to start with, so you need your tome in front of you. I'm going to start with table 3.1, which is page 53. And you've got a nice pedagogical chart there of the consonants that you're interested in. The only one that is not here that you will have to address probably is the American flap, and I'll come to that a little bit later in the PowerPoint. But basically, all the consonants that you have here are the consonants that your students are going to have to address. So the voiceless pairs, b, d, g, v, the, z, j, sh, h, ch, j, m, n, l, r, w, wh. I don't say the wh. I don't know how many of you say the wh. I never say which. I think it sounds very strange. I only say which. I don't know how many of you do that. Do that wh sound. Which one? And the y sound. Is there anything there that anyone wants to, before we move on from that table, is there anything there that anyone wants to ask about? Okay, so 3.6, and please do interrupt me at any time. I have no problem being interrupted. That's one good thing when you're married, I've discovered. You get used to being interrupted a lot. Also when you have children. Yeah. Okay, so table 3.6. We are, okay, so this is the table that's the portrait landscape, and this is nice. This puts everything in your three classifications. So you've got your manner of articulation down the side with your voiced and voiceless pairs, and your place of articulation along the top. Again, these are literally the sounds that we just saw. Anybody? There's only one. We are coming back to this, but that sound down under Vela liquid, that's the dark L versus the light L. We're going to come back to that. I have a slide with L, so we'll come back to that. If you're not, excuse me, if you're not familiar with dark L, we're going to talk about that in a second. Other than that, everything should look familiar, but if it doesn't, let me know. I'm going to stop for a second. All right. Now this part is that part right at the top that we had. This part right here, description and analysis. Okay, this is meta-linguistic analysis. This, it turns out, is super useful for adults, not so much for kids. Teenagers seem to respond, you know, teenage sort of depends where you are. Teenagers, what can you do? So, but a lot of adults really respond well because it gives them something to hold on to. So several of you, when you were doing your reflections, which were great, said, yeah, basically my whole life has been listen and repeat, which is fine, except for if you can't perceive it well, the listen and the repeat isn't particularly helpful. And also for many adults, an articulatory explanation like this can help beyond the listen and repeat. I mean, I can keep saying it's light and right, and you say, you know, light, and I say no, light, right, no, light, right, and we're not getting anywhere. We're not moving forward in any obvious way at all, because that's the limitation of the imitation and repeat model. So other ways of approaching it include articulatory explanations. And notice that your book gives you sort of multiple ways. I'm not going to go through them all, but 3.7 and 3.8 give you multiple ways to describe those to your students and to work with articulatory explanations. So that's how you want to think about this consonant table and articulation. Like if you have a good moment to use it, articulatory explanations of consonants can be super helpful. A lot more helpful, I might add, than articulatory explanations of vowels, which are often not helpful because you're like, well, it's sort of at the back, you know, go to the back. You're like, oh, rather than, you know, and it's like, but consonants is pretty clear. Consonants have very clear articulatory guidelines, so it can be super useful. All right, so here we go, and I've used the L as a way to do that. So the standard approach to all consonant production is to use minimal pairs, right? Right, light, might, night, every time you're focusing on one discriminatory sound. And your book moves from highly constrained to more communicative activities, all using minimal pairs, right? That example I gave you earlier where I said you can have a map and say to people, you know, find the road that's you know, Loyal Road. And then they have to distinguish between Loyal Road and Royal Street, you know, so you're still working with minimal pairs, but it's a much more communicative activity than just drilling away at a minimal pair over and over again. Also, the other thing it's also important to remember with minimal pairs is that minimal pairs aren't just the beginning. It's not just light, right. Okay, minimal pairs appear at the beginning, in the middle of words, and at the end of words, right? So you have something like lake, rake. In the example I've got here is the middle, right? At the beginning, sorry. Then you have at the end, sail. I can't even say it properly. And I'll come back to that, why I can't in a minute. Rail, for example. No, it would have to be sail. And then something with the R at the end. Sail. I don't know, I can't think of one. Palace in the middle. Then you've got consonant clusters. You've got consonant clusters at the beginning. So BL, and consonant clusters at the end. So LK, right? Now, obviously I'm just doing this with L. You can do it with R, you can do it with M, you can do it with N, you can do it with any of them. But remember that it's not just the beginning. We often think of just the beginning, like, right, men, oh, I can't even think of anything now, but anyway, you take my point. Now, the reason that I have a problem saying sail is because I have a very dark L. Cockney English has virtually no final L at all. I'm Greenbelt Cockney, which means that I didn't grow up within the sound of the bow bells, but I grew up speaking in estuary English that has come out from London English basically. And we have virtually no dark L at the end of our words at all. So dark L means it comes at the end as opposed to the front. So for example, I say Sal, which is, sounds like there's no L. So for that, S-A-I-L, I say Sal. Sow of a boat, so which sounds like a pig. I understand that. So this is a real problem for when I try and say sail with a dark L at the end. I struggle with that. This has caused me big problems while I've been living in America, because I like, well, not lately because I haven't gone to get any coffee, but back in the day when one used to be able to go get coffee, I would say I wanted a tall cappuccino, and meaning T-A-L-L, and they would say 2 cappuccinos because they expected me to say tall cappuccino. So then I would say no, tall cappuccino with the L, 2 L's on the end. So it's very dialect specific how clear your dark L's are at the end. And it's interesting because for me, you know, having said to you, most things don't cause comprehensibility problems. That's a classic intelligibility. And then, so that person, the barista, can't actually work out what I'm saying, T-A-L or T-W-O, and just assumes it's T-W-O, right? So then thus that builds in a comprehensibility problem that they think I want 2 cappuccinos. So it's been a very interesting experience for me. Most Americans have a much stronger dark L at the end of their words, so it's less of a problem. Now, from that perspective, I'm more like your average Vietnamese speaker who has real trouble pitching that coda and may say sao, sao, or not even, at least I actually say Sal because I know that there's kind of an N part. So a Vietnamese person might say Sa without any N coda as well. So yeah, so it's kind of interesting from that perspective. All right, so that's light and dark L, which so the dark L is the one with the little line through it on the IPA. The next thing I wanted to pick out, so I'm just picking out, you'll see that there's pages and pages, and the reason that there's pages and pages is they give you tons of great ideas of how to teach stuff. So let's say you decide you've got a real problem between the S and the Z. You can go into this chapter and find a gazillion exercises, communicative, guided on how to do that. So it's a wonderful resource. The next part I'm going to pull out is the syllabic consonants, which I also assume maybe you've dealt with in 555. And that's the idea of the final syllable having just a, so a syllable is defined as being a syllable because it's got a vowel in it, right? So syllabic, and so in English we have consonants with 1 vowel, we have consonants with syllables with 1 vowel, syllables with a consonant and vowel, syllables with a consonant, vowel, consonant, and so on. Okay, but the definition of syllable is that you have to have that vowel there. Well, in the case of words like button, how would you say that? Button, button? B-U-T-T-O-N. Someone say it for me.
Button? I don't know.
Thanks, Sarah. Oh, Liliana, was that you? Say it again.
Button?
Button. Yeah, right. Okay. So that at the end there is what's called a syllabic consonant, because it really is tricky to find a vowel in there. Okay. That's the kind of syllable that sometimes people transcribe with a schwa and an n, so button, and sometimes people just put the syllabic n with the little line underneath it, and that means syllabic. How do you decide? Well, the only way to define it is acoustically, and you look at a machine and you say, are there any vowel parts to this acoustic thing that I'm looking at, or are there only consonant parts? Okay, so a vowel, if you look at a sound acoustically, vowel has these thick dark lines, and then the consonant doesn't, right? So if you say button and you look at it acoustically, you can say, there's no thick striation, so there's no vowel, it's just the n. So perceptively, there is no way to define this. I get really annoyed when people are like, should there be a schwa in there or not? It's, other than acoustically, there's no way to tell, okay? So it really doesn't matter. So I don't give you any IPA tests because I was totally traumatized, as I told you, by my own training in IPA. However, if I did, I would never say, what's the difference? You know, you have to learn to transcribe the difference between a schwa and an n and a syllabic n, because the difference is totally acoustic, and you have to be looking at a machine to see it. So it really doesn't matter. So as long as you've got that n, pedagogically, that's the important part. The important part is that final consonant. Yeah. So you can transcribe it either way. And if somebody tells you otherwise, if somebody told you in 555 otherwise, you tell me and I'll tell them that they're wrong. All right. And then the next thing that your book does is talk about consonant clusters. Again, English is a tricky little sucker. It has so many consonant clusters that your poor learners have to learn. And if they're from a language like Chinese or Vietnamese, you know, they don't have this many, they don't have a consonant cluster with 4 consonants in it. They're like, well, what are you doing to me and my mouth? I can't produce that. Just so again, unfortunately, when you look at the research on intelligibility and comprehensive, particularly the research on comprehensibility, this is a problem. So if you're not producing the front end and the back end of the syllable, you do have a problem. And you might remember last week I used the Georgia Tech example of the Vietnamese who ended up at Georgia Tech when they wanted to be in Georgia State. And it was because they couldn't do these onset and coda of the syllables. So sadly, even though it is a bit of a nightmare for many learners, it's also super important. So that is something that it's worth spending serious time on. If you have a learner who has this problem, then particularly a learner from an Asian language, it is worth spending serious time trying to help them address that. So there's lots of examples in your book of single, double, triple onsets, and then all the possibility of the final codas. So there are lots of exercises that you can use if you have learners with these kind of issues. All right. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about under this is your classic American flap. So it's only you guys that do this, which amuses me greatly. None of the rest of us do this. By that, I mean traditional English speakers. So my favorite is butter. So that is me trying to do an American flap. When I try to do an American flap, I have another problem, which is that I also don't pronounce the R at the end of the word. So I end up with butter, and people are like, that totally doesn't even remotely sound American. So I have to remember to go butter with the flap and R. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you nodding helpfully there that I think you understand me. So this is a good example of the distinction between perception and production, right? If you're in England, right, if I'm posh, I will say butter, right? Or party, right? If I'm not posh, i.e. me, from London, I will say butter or party, okay? If I'm American, I will say butter, party, I guess. So, so this is a classic thing of perception rather than production. If you have learners that, as we say, want to be comprehensible but don't particularly care if they sound like an American through and through, then you can just work with the consonant. So just the t, right, and say it's party, right? But in terms of perception, they have to be able to hear it, right? They have to hear that that flap is supposed to be a T in order for them to understand the word that you're saying. So this could be one of the areas where if you are given an option to work on a curriculum, you know, you don't want to ignore the flap if they're going to be in an American environment. But for example, if they're going back to Asia or to Saudi Arabia or whatever, the model that they're highly likely to have is a British model. So certainly it's not worth spending hours and hours trying to teach them how to pronounce a flap. I mean, it's good that they recognize a flap, but it would be a total waste of your curricular time. In Indian English, for example, they have a retroflex flap. So it's tar, tar, tar. If you wind your tongue all the way back around and then hit the back of the top of your mouth, you're going to get a retroflex. So you could have everything from to the flap party to retroflex party to glottal party. You could have all of those things. So you're really just looking for intelligibility here, like perception. Can they tell the difference between those things? And this is another area where it becomes super important what they're going to be involved with. You know, who they're going to be talking to and why they're talking, right? Rather than saying you have to familiarize yourself with all of those things. Okay, questions on that lot? Questions or comments?
I had a question, Ms. Pickering. I don't know, are we still on that slide to chapter 3? Because I don't know if my screen's stuck or we're on that slide still.
Is that you, Juan?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, where are you? Where do you think I am?
What I'm looking at is chapter 3. It's a slide, it's the 12th slide.
Ooh, yeah, you're way back. Did my screen stop?
No.
It did on my end.
Oh, it did for you, Juan. Okay, everybody else says their screens were moving. No, you were supposed to be on screen 19 by now.
I guess I'll try to jump out and back in. Maybe I'll reset.
Yeah, or download it from the thing. Sorry, D2L.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, it's there. So you were just basically saying, am I supposed to memorize everything you just said, or was it on slides?
Yes, I guess so.
Okay, you are, yeah. Okay, no, it was all on slides. You've basically, everything I just said is on slides 13 through 19, so don't worry. Yep.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anybody else? So, I mean, I'm interested. Was everyone familiar with this difference between flap, glottal, consonant, is this something you did in 555, or are you familiar with it for other reasons?
For me, with the American flap, when you were talking about your British, the accent, my boyfriend is British, and so I really enjoy taking the mick out of him for his pronunciation. We go back and forth all the time, and especially with math or maths.
Yes.
That's that one debate that I won't give up. It should be math.
You think, well, actually, and you can, after 25 years, I now say math. And
Yes.
frankly, it's easier. You might want to tell him it's easier, because maths is one of those nasty consonant coda clusters at the end that does a number on you. So
I'm going to tell him. I'm going to tell him. But I enjoyed listening about the American flap, and now I'm explaining to him, this is why I sound this way. This is why you sound this way. So I really enjoyed that.
And there's no, I mean, it's so fascinating to me, because it's all fine. You know, it's just all different. But there's nothing that's it. Now, if you want to talk about English as a lingua franca, your best bet is probably to go with the t sound, the actual. And I say this because I have a friend who does aviation English, and looks at also black boxes and things, so can see where problems between, you know, so the international language of aviation, as you all know, probably is English. And the worst offenders, he tells me, and he did a conference paper on this, the worst offenders are the Americans. So when you do aviation English, much as we love you, Sarah, when you do aviation English, they tell you that you're supposed to sound incredibly clear and articulate very well. So that would be, for example, if you were saying continental, in aviation English, we're all supposed to say, apparently, continental, because it's easier, so it's right. But the American pilots apparently say, this is Continental 212, and everyone's like, what?
I can imagine that.
Yeah. And they pronounce this flap. This is Continental 212 instead of, and they get into trouble with some of the, people in the tower who say, did you just say Continental? On the American,
I can imagine
dropping.
Yeah.
Say, yeah, I said Continental. But they know they're supposed to be clearer. So if you're looking at it from a lingua franca perspective, you know, you can go with the clearest articulation. But yeah, good. I'm glad.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. All right, then let's move on to part 3. Juan, I hope that you found because we're now on part 3, which is slide 20. So hopefully did you get there?
Yes, ma'am. I actually got on, got back in. I don't know if you noticed, and it reset it apparently or something.
Oh, good. Okay, fantastic. All right. So now we're on electronic resources. You know, again, I'm older than a lot of you, but not all of you. So this has been a revelation to me. You know, back in the day, literally all we had was a language lab, and you all trooped in there and had a little cassette recorder. And I could listen, as the teacher at the top, I could listen to different people. I was fine, but now we have a gazillion websites and apps that teachers can use. Excuse me. And I encourage you to take a look at all of them. They're just, I mean, it's now too much for me to even, when I started teaching this 15 years ago, I would say, well, there's this one thing that everybody uses, and now it's like so much that I can't do that anymore. I have picked out a few for you to start with that me and the teachers that I've worked with have found super interesting. The first one is a downloadable app and it's by Ron Thompson, who is a professor at Brock, and he came last year. He's also a friend of mine. He came last year and he gave us a talk and he demonstrated the app. The idea of this app, and I spoke to someone about this, I forget who I was talking to, but it was someone in the homework where they said they were concerned about their Southern accent. And I said, well, actually, that's no bad thing, because what all the research in perception suggests is that high variability phonetic training is the way to go. What that means is that the more different models of a given sound that a learner can hear, the better, the stronger their perceptual categorization of that sound. So this is totally perception, not production. But if you can give them multiple representations, that makes that phonetic categorization more and more robust. So you don't want to just give them one model of one American speaking Midwest American, you know, a sound, right? A vowel or a consonant, particularly vowels. Then because this high variability phonetic training suggests that the more the better. So what Ron did was develop this app. It's as far as I know, it's still free. If you can download it, you can play with it. He looks at vowels and consonants. It's just a series of games where you can try and identify whether you hear the same or different, and so on. It's a lovely one. It's the only one I've got in here that's perception only. All the rest of them are production, or production and perception. Uglish, I don't know if anyone's used Uglish, but it's pretty cool. So you can put in any word, for example, continental. And Uglish does this massive quick search and comes up with the word being used in natural speech. So, or several versions of the word being used in natural speech. So it's super good to get your learners, adult learners who are struggling with what we call greenhouse speech to jungle speech. And what that means, greenhouse speech is where all the sounds are separate, right? They're all in separate little pots. So that's how we learn it. We say, here's a r, here's a l, here's a this word, here's that word. But actually, in reality, in the jungle, everything's all smushed together, right? So it's not super clear. Sounds get smushed together, and it gets more tricky to do that listening. So what Uglish does is recognize that greenhouse to jungle effect and say, here is a given word that you choose in several different contexts. This is how it might sound in reality, as opposed to how it might sound in the textbook CD, which is often very greenhouse individualized, right? Sounds of speech you may have used in 555. Did anyone use that in 555 or 501? Maybe. Okay, this is an awesome one. I would demonstrate it to you, but I have a distinct feeling that I'll lose my recording or everything else because I'm just not very good at this. So, but you should go to it. It's an app that you can pay for, or you can just check out the site. And what it does is give you the articulatory diagram, and it's a moving so you can see what's happening, and then it gives you the sound, and it also gives you a picture of a mouth, so you can see exactly what's going on. Liliana, you've seen this site?
Yeah, I actually I bookmarked all the sites that we use for that class, and that is one of the ones that I
yeah. It's super good. It's one of the oldest. It's been there for forever. In fact, it was super annoying that they turned it into an app, because now the site is less good than it used to be. I can't believe they decided they wanted to try and make money out of it. It's the University of Iowa, for God's sake. But anyway, so it's a super useful app for adults if they, if you've got an adult, particularly, again, if you're working with someone, let's say a business person who says, I want to sound as close to a native speaker as I possibly can. An app like Sounds of Speech, you know, will help them do that, because they can just keep working with that app and working with the articulation and the sound. Manythings.org is something that teachers, a lot of K through 12 teachers like as well. It has a gazillion things you can do, including songs, podcasts, all kinds of things. It's a real teacher friendly, it's a classroom friendly site, and I think you'll enjoy it. And then there's memrise.com, which is sort of like Duolingo, which some of you may know. You can try it out for free, the basic thing for free, but then you have to pay for it if you like. I can't remember how much it is. I've never downloaded Memrise, but you know, again, it's another. These are apps that either I like, or the ones that I like are English Accent Coach. Actually, the first 4, and then the last one was recommended to me by another teacher. So you can check it out and see whether you like it. So what I want you to do for your reading post, you've got a discussion section open for this one, is pick at least 3 of the sites, okay, or if you have a site, a go-to site that you love, you can pick that as well, one of those and 2 of these. And I want you to spend some serious time with it. Don't just open it and say, oh, I want you to, like, you know, do whatever you can with it for 5 or 10 minutes and really sort of get a sense of what it might be able to do. And then tell me what you did. So what did you practice? What activities did you try? What things do you think they might be useful for? Whether, you know, was it good? I mean, was it something that you could navigate well or not navigate well? And then if you have one that you like, it was someone last year that introduced me to, one of the students in this class last year introduced me to Manythings, and I love it. It's great. So if you have one that you like that you want to pick instead, go ahead. And then if, you know, once you've turned that reading post in, I'll send out the information to everybody to everybody else to say that there was this good thing that we didn't include. Yeah, so boom, we are done. Right, any comments or questions? Because that's all I have for you today. You know, do you know how long you're supposed to do wait time in a classroom? Did you cover that in TESOL methods? Does anyone remember how long wait time is supposed to be? Say it out loud, Liliana.
3 seconds?
Oh, longer than that. Longer than that. Anyone? It's supposed to be 6 to 8 seconds. And actually, when you do it for 6 to 8 seconds, you realize it's a really long time. Because everyone's sitting there looking at each other. So let's see how long that is. I'll count. Anyone have a question? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. Well done. Okay, you know that most of us never wait long enough when we ask our students. That was always my thing in TESOL methods. Yeah, like you have to wait until everybody's feeling really uncomfortable. Then you can move on. All right, well, I am done with you, so I am going to stop recording. However, if anybody does want to stay on, I'm not going anywhere. If you are done for the day, I will see you next week. And if you have any questions for me whatsoever, just stay on as everybody leaves and we will talk. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hi, Dr. Pickering.
Hello, Julia.